Glad to see you. And my name is Ann Ackerson, and I am the Communications and Development Coordinator at COSA and the producer of In Conversation With, which is a series of programs that the Council of State Archivists has been putting on since late 2020, focusing on contemporary issues shaping the work of archives and records programs. And over the course of this year, 2021, the conversations in this series will span three broad topic areas, and they are diversity and inclusion, the workplace here and now, and the future of work and the workplace. And we're absolutely delighted that the series this year is being supported by our corporate sponsors, Atlas Systems. So today we're in front of a live audience, and this is a little bit of a new thing for us, but we're really happy you're all here. And we're going to be talking about artificial intelligence as an emerging tool for archives. We're joined today by Dr. Anthea Sellis, who is the Secretary General of the International Council on Archives, and Roger Chrisman, Senior State Governor's Records Archivist at the Library of Virginia, and our moderator, Nick Canizzo, a project manager for COSA's State Electronic Records Initiative. Welcome all of you, and thank you. And you certainly can post your questions in the chat box, but we welcome you to also just speak up if you have questions or raise your hand, and we'll get to you throughout the conversation. This is meant to be informal, and so we hope that you join in. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Nick, who will kick off the conversation. Nick.
Great, thank you. And once again, welcome everyone. Thank you, Anthea. Thank you, Roger, for coming and sharing your thoughts on artificial intelligence and, well, everything related to that. I'm going to hopefully not throw you too many curveballs, but yeah, we really hope we can hear some questions from the audience as well. Go ahead and type it in chat. I'll be monitoring them throughout. So, whatever comes to your mind, that's what we're here for. So I guess I would start the questioning by saying, to Roger and Anthea, well, I might as well start with you, Roger. Can you give us a little background, both on yourself and your experience with artificial intelligence?
Sure, thanks, Nick. I've been an archivist at the Library of Virginia since 1997, and prior to that, I worked at South Carolina State Archives. My focus has been on governor's records for about the last 15 years. And my experience with artificial intelligence came accidentally, really. In 2012, I started manually processing the email from Governor Kane's administration. And we did the first release of that in January of 2014, about 400, I reviewed 400,000 messages, and I think the actual number that we could release was like 133,000. And that got the attention of two academics, Gordon Cormack and Maura Grossman at the University of Waterloo, who have developed a continuous active learning technology-assisted review supervised machine learning approach. That's a mouthful. Basically, it's a way to use artificial technology to process, in this case, email. And what intrigued them is they had an answer key. I had reviewed 400,000 and I said, well, this is a record, this is a non-record, this needs to be restricted, this needs to be redacted. And they wanted to do a research project using that key to see if it would have been faster to use that tool instead of manually doing that. And that's what we did. I do want to bring up one issue just because this came up yesterday in the Siri webinar about RATOM. We had an issue with, could we allow Waterloo access to the full set of data, including the restricted materials? And we had to get creative about that. We made Gordon and Maura volunteers so they would be covered under the library's privacy rules, just like any state employee signs about that along those lines. And Gordon came down and set up a terminal that the library controlled and operated so we could run the test on a machine And this part I don't fully understand. He was not actually able to see the content of these messages. But we were able to do the test, and the test showed that myself and the machine could do it better and much faster than just myself alone, significantly faster. And our experience since then is we've hired, essentially had a contract with Gordon and Mora to process email for Governor Bob McDonnell, which was 6.3 million, and Governor Terry McAuliffe, which was a little over 10 million. And I can talk more about that later, but that's sort of where I'm coming from, just a narrow focus using a particular tool.
Great, and yeah, we are going to talk about that later. so thanks for mentioning that. And how about you, Anthea? How did you get started with AI, and what's your experience?
Much of my experience it stems from multiple different sort of facets of work that I've done. So, when we talk about artificial intelligence, a lot of this kind of started with big data and big data processing for accountability, transparency. So when the big discussion around big data was happening and big data for open government, I was working for an organization called the International Records Management Trust. And I was working primarily in sub-Saharan Africa, looking at how data integrity affected development initiatives, in particular things like open government partnership, sustainable development goals, then what was called the Millennium Development Goals, and how data integrity could affect the tracking and monitoring of development projects, as well as accountability and transparency initiatives within governments, particularly in East Africa. From there, I moved on to the National Archives in the United Kingdom. While I was there, I was responsible for overseeing government digital records transfers. One of the issues with our government departments had, which kind of was the springboard for testing more off-the-shelf commercial software. So these would have mostly e-discovery systems. Our government departments, a lot of them didn't know what they had in terms of legacy data. So they had large legacy holdings, so anything that wasn't active material that it was being created. And they need to start appraising and selecting that material and doing sensitivity reviews, so figuring out what was sensitive and what was not sensitive before they could transfer to National Archives. And it was actually becoming a blocker because although the volumes for the materials we were looking at would be considered quote unquote small. So these were materials from the mid to late 1990s that we were looking to transfer. As with many institutions and departments responsible for information management, they didn't have the resource to be able to do the manual review. And it was becoming a blocker to doing digital transfers to National Archives. And so a colleague of mine, Carolyn Pegden, and I started looking at off-the-shelf commercial software. We did a very light touch sort of analysis. We looked at 3 different types of algorithms, 3 different types of e-discovery data analytics companies to begin to try and understand how effective they would be for doing appraisal and selection and then sensitivity review. And as we began engaging with that, we also noticed that government was using more and more artificial intelligence or machine learning technologies in order to facilitate policy decisions. And so we also had to envisage the possibility of AI or machine learning as an actual record in terms of looking at accountability and transparency from that perspective. And I've continued to kind of do more research than I would say practical applied research, more reading for the time being while I'm Secretary General, although I am currently working on a project that might lead into some more practical applied looking at AI and how we use it in the archival profession.
Great, thank you both, and Dr. Sells, I'm actually going to throw the next question right back to you, which is, I think just for our audience in general, and certainly for me, I think that the idea of artificial intelligence broadly is very vulnerable to misconceptions. So, do you think you could provide for us a quick overview, given your expertise, on what are we actually talking about when we're talking about AI or machine learning or deep learning or any of these tools or techniques?
Of course. So I'm sure computer scientists would manifestly disagree with what I'm about to say, but in the research that I have done, I have found no real agreed definition of what AI is. It is more of a catch-all term for everything that's related to training a machine to process large amounts of data and make connections based on questions or problems that we need the machine to help us figure out, whether that's an appraisal and selection question, or whether that's a policy decision. Under sort of the umbrella of artificial intelligence, if you want, you've got sort of different subsets, again, varying levels of agreement around definition. So there's something called machine learning. So machine learning kind of falls into two big categorizations. One is supervised. So that is where, like what Roger will talk about, where you mark up a data set and then you train the machine to help you to figure out to do the work for you, essentially. It's a lot of upfront work though, and I'm sure Roger will attest to all the work that had to go into training the machine to be able to identify the relevant set of email that would eventually be taken in by the archives. Then there's unsupervised, which is a machine that has kind of already been trained to do something. So you need to be mindful that simply because they say it's unsupervised and that it can do all these weird and wonderful things, it's been trained to do and identify information in a specific way. You can still sometimes train these machines. It depends on the vendor and how willing and maneuverable the system is at that point, and how much leeway they're willing to give you to add layers of training to the machine. But it still is that you, instead of having the marked up data like you would with the supervised, we use the marked up data to then feed in unmarked up data to be able then to identify that. You would do that normally to ensure the precision and recall. So precision and recall is essentially accuracy of the output, because you want to make sure that you're going to get again, we can talk about this during the course of the discussion, but you want to get a decent amount of accurate return. So, 80, 85% in that range. And then, but unsupervised, you're just feeding the information in and it's already doing the work for you. You still need to do a level of sort of precision and accuracy, precision and recall testing. The issue then, though, is you get into some copyright intellectual property issues when you try and do that. So it's just to be mindful of that. So that's kind of the subheadings of what I would call machine learning. Under another subset to machine learning is called neural networks. And so this is where you have multiple algorithms, or one algorithm that kind of acts like a brain. It kind of figures out which piece of information is the right piece of information to then move on. But it's constantly iteratively learning. And then when you start talking about deep neural networks or deep machine learning, this is multiple neural networks that you have layered one on top of the other. And so, for example, facial recognition software is a deep neural network, because you have one algorithm that's identifying skin color, another algorithm that's identifying eye color, another algorithm that's identifying co-location of your eyes to your ears to your mouth, which then kind of outputs it into a unique number that's kind of assigned to your face. And then that helps to identify your facial features. But that's a deep neural network. But that's like multiple algorithms that have been trained to do many different things using photographs. Again, we can talk about bias and the levels of accuracy around deep neural or machine facial recognition software, depending on your training data set. So those are kind of what I would call the broad grouping. So artificial intelligence, machine learning, and then deep neural networks from there.
Okay, that was a great overview. And, Roger, just to flip it back to you, I would ask you to say, your experience with kind of being on the, like you've already kind of iterated upon this yourself, and then you're kind of bringing the AI techniques to this later. Do you find that it was supplementary to your work, or replaces your work, or lives in symbiosis with your work? How would you say that the tools impacted the way that your process?
It gets the work done faster and keeps my sanity. Manually reviewing this type of material is not viable. It's not sustainable. You can't do it. And I can go into an example with the Governor McDonnell one as well, that you're going to need some type of tool if you're taking in collections, as like I described earlier, of 6 million to 10 million messages. If these are huge collections, you can't physically review the material, nor should you. And I think staff and administrators are going to have to get used to that fact and become comfortable. You're not going to be able to look at everything, but you're going to have to come up with procedures to show due diligence. Like we've used this tool to go through Governor McDonald's email, but there's certain accounts that I know contain restricted material, sensitive material. I'm going to go back and look at those again. You may still not catch everything, but you can show you've demonstrated you've tried to do your best in doing that and document that along the way. So it's very much a time saver. And the ultimate goal is to get this stuff out there that it's publicly available. Because if you try to do this manually, you're never going to get anything out there. You just won't. And what's the point of it then?
So what does that, can you go into a little detail just in your experience, what that training process looks like, the actual training of the machine? How does that actually work?
Sure, I got some numbers and whatnot here for, let me just get down to it. Governor, I'll use the one case, the example, Governor Bob McDonnell was Virginia's governor from 2010 to 2014. We used the tool that Gordon and Maura have created to process and review all of the email. So what that meant was I prepared and got ready the PST, these were in Microsoft PST files. For the administration, I identified 712 PST files containing 6.3 million emails. Gordon takes that and he tries to do deduplication, standardizing. I think he numbers every single one. The next step in this process with supervised training is he gave me a random sample from that entire collection to mark up essentially, and the categories would be, it's an open record, it's open but something in it needs to be redacted from it, it's restricted, or it is a non-record or non-archivable. It may be technically a public record about setting up a meeting, but it's not something it's transitory, you don't really want to keep it. So I go through that first batch. You've now created the training set. So what the tool then does, the algorithm tries to find, based on that training set, identify additional records that meet the criteria. I'll get the next set of that. And you start marking that up again. It goes back to it and those are added to the training set. And you continue this process until essentially all relevant emails, in our case, looking for archivable emails and open, redacted, and restricted are finished. And my colleague at the library, Susan Gray Page, refers to the analogy is to microwave popcorn. The way to view this is you put the microwave popcorn in, you start it up, it goes slow, you start getting some pops, then it just goes crazy in the middle. And that's where you're getting all the records that you want. And then it sort of dies down at the end. And when it starts dying down, there's no right or wrong answer to this, but you say, we're done. It's not worth digging in any further to look for this material. And to give you a sense with the McDonnell administration and the time savings, the 6.3 million email messages, I only had to review as part of the training 28,550, which took me 113 hours to do. So after all was said and done, the tool identified 1.5 million archival records, 1.4 billion were open, then there was a pile of redacted and restricted. So to give a sense of the time savings, using my processing statistics there, of the 28,000 when I reviewed them in 113 hours, that came out that I reviewed 252 emails per hour. If I tried to manually review at that rate, the 6.3 million, that would take 25,150 hours. And if a person works 2,000 hours a year, 50 weeks times 40 hours a week, which is just to make it even, one person would take 12 and a half years to do that manually. Or if you had 4 staff members like we have, and that's all we did, 8 hours a day at that rate, that would take 3 years. You can't physically do it. because you can't do this 8 hours in a row. You want to blow your brains out. I mean, I can't go more than 5 hours of looking at this, and it's a point of diminishing returns. The stress of it, trying to manually review it, et cetera. So that's sort of the process. And as I said, then we're going to go back and do some due diligence, do some spot checking. Haven't given real thought about that on when we're doing that, because I'm now doing Terry McAuliffe as well. But at some point, I'm going to have to go back to look at that. And some of the conversations that we haven't had yet is, well, what do you do with that pile that probably doesn't have any records in? How long do you keep it? I mean, this comes kind of up with bias. Like, I'm the one deciding what is now a public record, me alone. And I'm very much aware of that. And I probably have blinders, and we haven't thought of this through yet, but how do we go about some sort of process to look at that other pile to make sure we didn't overlook something significant, based because I'm human and I'm fallible. So
yeah, I think that, you know, if given no experience with this, you know, certainly I would be nervous, you know, destroying a record without ever having looked at it myself. So one of the things that you said that I think is a key point to this is there a way to audit the results? Is there a way to not necessarily review every record, but review the results of the record? I mean, the products on the market now, or the techniques that we're using, do they allow a substantial amount of auditing, both by the professionals who are doing this work, but also members of the public, concerned citizens, things like that, people who might want to check to make sure that what we're doing is appropriate? And that's a question for either of you.
I don't know that the citizens would know. Like, when we talk about this and we talk about the technologies that we're using, and I'm not to say that they would never come to that point where they could be able to audit us, but I think at this point they wouldn't even know what to ask. And this was the issue when we first started doing, not necessarily the AI in the work at National Archives, but we were asking our users, and this was back in 2013, what do you want to use the digital record for? Like, how do you want to use it? So that we knew when we were going through the acquisition process, the types of metadata we would need in order to be able to render it properly. And they had no idea. That's not to say there aren't regression models and work being done on regression models in academic environments that can kind of retroactively go through the material. The issue is we come back to this question of intellectual property for off-the-shelf commercial software. It's once you apply regression models that you begin to understand how the technology is working at that point, and that then kind of takes away their market advantage, which then becomes problematic for them, but is also problematic for us in terms of really measuring. You know, Roger's lucky; he's got kind of an algorithm that's kind of been built for him. When you're dealing with off-the-shelf commercial software, it is much more difficult to be able to understand what's going on and sometimes how the results are being rendered and the levels of accuracy, at precision and recall. And I think when we come down to this question, though, of precision and recall, though, leaving aside the whole issue around the auditability, even though there are huge movements within the computer science community around algorithmic accountability, especially given recent uses of algorithms in the justice system to measure recidivism rates, which I'm sure you're all aware of, so I'm not going to go back through that particular piece of research. And, you know, they only found out about it after they started looking at the base data and started seeing what some of the issues are. But that said, coming back to the issue of precision and recall, it's how you need to figure out what your risk appetite is, because it'll never be 100%. And so as archivists, we want it to be 100% because we're perfectionists and we want it to be perfect and square. We don't want to let it out unless we know we're like 100% sure it's going to be great. And the problem is that it was never great to begin with. But the thing is that it's less, what we were doing in paper was less discoverable. And I think that's sort of the issue that we're running up against. And we've never had to we talk about risk management, but in different contexts. We've never had to talk about risk management, I think, in some of the work that we do. And in AI, in the application of AI, we very much need to look at this because it'll never be 100%. And it's kind of a sliding scale of risk. It's a sliding scale of what you're willing to let go of. And it will depend on every context and the types of records you're dealing with. So when we were doing this in National Archives UK, we used what we called the funnel technique. And so we knew, and I think Roger picked up on this already, like 50% of what we were dealing with was duplicate. You can get into a discussion about meaningful and non-meaningful duplication, but leaving that aside, if you cut it down by half, from there, what we knew was that about 75% of the materials, the content that we needed to look at for a sensitivity review was around personal data. And we knew the machines could do that well, because the literature and some of the findings we were getting was that once you iteratively trained, as Roger was talking about, kind of retraining the machine to get a sufficiently high hit rate. So the literature was reaching 90% around personal data. We got to about 80%. So when we talk about personal data in the UK context, it's name, address, social insurance number, visa numbers, all that kind of stuff. So we were getting a decent hit rate. So we knew that we had a level of certainty there. It still means 20% might get out, but we had 80% that we knew we'd identified. And then we had this 30 to 25% of the rest of the information, which was national security, international relations, information provided in confidence. And at that point, we knew the machines can't do that. The machines that you get off the shelf will never be able to do that kind of very finessed context-based analysis. That's where you need the human. And because the human can figure out the context, the human can figure out whether something is being provided in context. The machine, a lot of vendors will say, well, if you have this word and this word co-located, it will be able to do it automatically. Yes and no, but we knew for certain that the human would be able to do it. And for those sensitivities, because I'm talking at a national level, we needed the human to do it. We needed that level of certainty from the human. Whereas, yes, okay, the leaking personal data is never great. But when I look at it, when I was looking at it at the national scale in the UK, I'm like, I would rather leak a little bit of personal data than national security or international relations. And so this is where the sliding scale of risk comes into play, and where we need to kind of get our mitigation strategies in place to be able to say, well, if we leak this, if this gets out, what are we going to do about it? What's our reaction? How are we going to manage it? Because this is more manageable than managing a national security breach.
Yeah, and that's a really good point that I want to get into probably with our next question. I really want to talk about the process of how to integrate these tools into not just the kind of the business of being an archivist, but also, we know that they're being used actually especially for a government audience, we know that they're being used in the wild already. But one thing I did want to ask before that is, you describe a scenario in which artificial intelligence is probably not going to help you that much, where you need really there's a lot of contextual information. How would you characterize the scenarios where these tools would be really appropriate for those of us in the audience who might be considering using this? Where should we think to apply this intelligently, or how should we think to apply this intelligently?
I think it depends on the question, right? And not to hedge and not to kind of sidestep the question, because I think too often when these machines are applied, we fail to understand the real question that we want the machine to help us answer. And that sometimes is very much based on the records that we're dealing with. And it's very specific to certain types of record groups that we're dealing with. And there's the issue here is there's a level of building the continuity in the machine to help you do and process this, but also the fact that you're going to have to retrain it sooner rather than later because of how heterogeneous the different records that we're dealing with are. And I think that's kind of part of the issue with trying to deploy them consistently in an archival context. And I think a quick and easy way, though I would always say be careful, because that's always what I say with these technologies. If there's 50% duplication, what we were seeing in a lot of the legacy data. And so I think there is potentially, and you can talk about it as your raw analysis, your redundant, obsolete, trivial. I think you need to be careful though, when you start talking about trivial in terms of early digital records, because what might be classified as trivial now in terms of size of file format is not trivial for mid 1990s. So you need to understand your records before you start applying the machine. You need to have a sense of what it is that you're working with. And sometimes what we used to do in National Archives is we did a first pass on the records, so we could get a sense of date. We could get a sense of file formats that we're dealing with. We could get a sense of, sometimes it would extract entities. And so we could kind of see the types of entities we were dealing with, because our departments had no idea what was in these records. And then what we would do is we would go back to the department and we would ask them some questions like, okay, so the records you gave us, like, give us a bit of the history of digital record keeping in your department. And sometimes we'd find missing information. So they would say, oh yeah, well, we implemented our first sort of information management type system, digital system in 1995. And yet what we were seeing in the first pass of those records was everything was from 2000. I'm like, well, stuff is from 1995, like, where is it? And we zoomed in, because sometimes the 1995 material could be really small in terms of file format. So what we did was we zoomed in on the visualization that we had, and nothing was coming up. And then we found out, in speaking to them, oh, well, we migrated everything in 2000 into our new information management system. So it inherited the date of migration. That brings with it a whole nother set of issues, which I'm not going to get into in terms of processes, but it did have, doing the first pass, using the machine as a first pass to help us get a sense of what we were dealing with. And then from there, we could build, using the entity extraction and interviews with the government department, we could build sort of like a timeline of significant events that we needed to pay attention to for the time slot that we were dealing with those particular records, which comes back to the point around, we would eventually have to retrain the records for the next set that we would receive, because what we were looking for would not necessarily be present. So we were dealing with primarily unstructured material, Word documents, PowerPoint presentations, sometimes videos. And so there was not a level of consistency that we could expect in the content of the records, because they reflect the change that's happening within the government, within government policy, within the department. I'm gonna hand off to Roger.
Yes, I would say the reason I felt comfortable using this technology was because I had essentially done that first pass. I had manually reviewed 400,000 plus emails, and I felt comfortable with it. And you get a sense of the content, again, just as she just mentioned, it's all situational about each different data set. In this case, a gubernatorial email collection is going to, you can't train it one time to do multiple administrations. You need to train it for each one, because each administration's unique in that way. But one thing I just wanted to throw in here somehow is just, it's machine assisted learning. It means you need a person, and the trainer is a subject specialist. So in my case, I'm the right person to do this, because this is what primarily my job is, focusing on the office of the governor. And what I learned from the Kane review is what would be really helpful to understand nuances as whatnot would be to have essentially a virtual subject file, a ready reference type file, which I could easily do because of compilations for news articles and things like that I had for McDonnell and McAuliffe. So I can quickly look something up and understand its context from that. But I may not be the right person to do another type of data set, because I may not be as expert, as knowledgeable in it as someone else. So that's sort of where, I just wanted to bring up that point about the subject specialist, and just the changing nature each time. I have to train the tool again for each governor. And like Governor McAuliffe, I'm training that one right now, and it's a larger data set, and I've had to do a lot more training to try to nail down some anomalies, especially in the redaction categories are sort of all over the place. thankfully, the restriction's looking really good. It's like an 80% precision on that. So that's all I have on that.
Well, great, thank you. Yeah, and you know, we've focused a lot of our conversation on kind of the archival perspective of using the tools ourselves, right? How do we actually use these machine learning to process records that are, or do appraisal, whatever it is. We mentioned earlier, talking about kind of the other side of the coin, which is our records creators, you know, who we're collecting, they're using these tools, whether they know it or not. How can archivists, you know, our primary audience here, how can we be prepared for records that are either created through, as you said, Roger, kind of machine assisted versus ones that are just created completely by machines, completely by these algorithms? How can we be ready for those? And maybe more importantly is, how can we even identify when that has happened?
So in terms of my experience, governments are already creating policies using AI. A perfect example, recent example, I'm going to use UK examples, European examples, because that's what I know, was the equivalent of the, the SATs for the UK. So they had to they canceled essentially the SAT test, the equivalent of the SAT test in the UK. And what they were doing was they used machine learning to infer the final grade of students. What ended up happening was that disproportionately students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds lost significant grade points on their grade point, which affected their ability to go into university. It was a huge scandal in the United Kingdom. And they eventually had to ask the teachers to go back and do all the marking anyway, because they wanted to take the teachers out of the equation because they felt there was a level of bias from the teachers to hike up the grades so that students got good grades and that the school got a good rating. So there's a whole host of stuff happening here. But what it demonstrates was really sometimes some of the ill-conceived uses of AI in government. And in those cases, if I was the archivist going into the situation and having to identify that mass of information, so I'd be looking for where are the emails or the reports that document what question you were asking? What is it you were trying to do with this machine? Number two would be, what were the data sets that you were using? How did you refine those data sets? Because you may have different data sets coming from different points, from different departments, from all over the place. Not all these data sets are going to be the same. They're going to have different points of measurement. So you're going to have to make decisions about which points of measurements are in, which points of measurements are out. And let's say you need to change the points of measurement. So you're measuring, instead of centimeters, you're going to go with millimeters. Well, all of that has an impact on how the machine is going to interpret and output their decision. So there's that sort of front end of the process, the whole data cleanup, the whole data selection, the bounding questions, the research questions that it is that you're looking to get the machine to deal with. And it's capturing all of that decision. There should be a log. Sometimes there isn't a log, but there should be a log that documents all of this. From there, it's then the sort of marked up data, or how they've put the data into the system to train the system then to arrive at least an initial answer. Because it's an iterative process, as Roger's already said, it takes multiple passes into the data to get it to a state where you have a precision and recall, you have a level of accuracy in the output that you are happy with, that you feel answers the questions, and that you feel is an accurate representation of what the data that you put in says. And so all of that process and the changes to the code, particularly if you're doing it in government, they'll be doing bespoke. So they'll be working with pre-existing code, and then they'll be changing the code all the way through. And all of those changes need to be documented, because each of those changes impacts the result to be able to get to the final point. This is the whole audit process. It's a huge process, and it's a huge volume of information. And the issue that we have as archives right now is, how do we capture all of this? And it's still a point of discussion. I don't think there is any sort of clear understanding of what this is going to look like for us. I was in a discussion at the Turing Institute in London around in data intensive research and how they might try and handle some of this. And what they were saying was, well, do you just acquire the data set and the final algorithm, and that's enough, because it's just too much to keep everything? And, you know, these are questions we're going to have to ask ourselves and consider also, are there decentralized models, given how big some of the things that we are eventually going to have to preserve? Are there decentralized custodian models that we need to consider, or consortiums we need to build? Because we're not each going to be able to build our own data center. It's not possible. And so how do we begin to do this? And I think too, there is a point around us as records managers and archivists and how we advise government departments regarding how they're deploying some of these technologies, because we're there, we have to be there from the beginning to know what it is that they're doing so we know what they're capturing. But I think increasingly there's a bit of a kind of, we almost have to ask, be a little bit of an ethical sort of barometer. The government will do what the government wants to do. I don't think there's anything we can do about that, but to be the barometer and say, where is the data? Because I used to do that when I was in UK government. I would go into some of the government departments that were using, at the time they were calling it big data, and saying, okay, and we're working and developing policies with this. And I said, well, where is the data set coming from? And they said, well, there's from this department, that department, we're just going to mesh everything together and put it all together. I'm like, okay, well, have you tracked which departments they're coming from? Yeah. We know where it's coming from. I said, okay, well, have you tracked how you're changing the data so that you can make sure that, because it's going to be used to make a policy decision, have you tracked the whole process and the code? Silence. And they're like, we don't need to do that. And I said, I think you should. Because I said, if you're pulled up in front of what was in the UK government, the Public Select Committee, if you're pulled up before the equivalent of like a Senate hearing or a congressional hearing in the sort of federal level in the United States, how are you going to explain to them what you've done and how you've gotten to that decision if you haven't documented that process? Look of fear in their eyes. But enough, I think, hopefully at that point I said, you need to do this. And this is one government department. There were others that were like gold standards. They were doing a really good job. They were doing it all. And I would always point those sort of slightly delinquent departments to this other one and say, you need to look at what they're doing and you need to pay attention to what they're doing, because I said, they're tracking and this is what you need to do. And so whether or not that department in the end decided to continue with that after I'd left, I don't know. But these are, I think, the type of the sort of like I said, the ethical sounding boards is what we need to be, just to kind of say, you may want to do this. Here's a potential consequence if you don't. And, that's up to you at this point.
Yeah, one thing I'm glad you mentioned, certainly the ethical concerns. As Anne said at the beginning of this call, one of the focuses of our conversation series is obviously diversity, inclusion, and I think that it raises a bunch of really interesting questions about bias and how there is bias not only in records creation. We know that's what government is doing. That's what everybody's doing. There's some inherent bias there, but there has for a long time, and I think we're maybe just realizing the depth of how there's bias in archival collecting as well, bias in appraisal and selection. And I guess a question for both of you, Roger, you having done this, really with a huge record set, and Dr. Sell is having so much experience with it. Can artificial intelligence, is it more likely to help us eliminate our bias, or is there a real risk that it's going to amplify our bias, right, and just shoot it into overdrive because we are maybe unwittingly putting bias into our record sets that then gets iterated upon over and over again?
That's a great question. I'm not sure what the answer is, if it can solve it one way or another, but my approach when I started the McDonald email was doing that initial training, especially. My default was, this is an open archival record unless otherwise, even if it seemed trivial, perhaps, because I knew that was setting the stage for what would come next. So I kept it probably very broad. And in the end, maybe that means we have to preserve a larger pile of records. I'm okay with that. We don't have to save all of them, but that's the only way I could think of doing it. That you really can't, from what Gordon and Moore have told me, you can't have too many teachers to do this, because there's what's an archival record can be it's all contextual based. It's the eye of the beholder, how much information you know about something in particular. I always use an example from the Kane collection where the subject heading is he okay? Not really. Thank you for all you do for him. And it's between the governor's confidential assistant and the governor's counsel. And it was a night of an execution. If you didn't know that by looking at the time stamp, that's an example. So I try to just take it, it's open unless there's something that's obvious, donuts in the break room, especially for that initial set. And then you sort of go from there and try to, I'd rather err on the side of too much than not enough. We're new at doing this. I don't know. We haven't gone back yet to look at the things that the tool said were not records. I want to go back and look in some of those accounts to see. I'm not sure how we're going to do that or have any procedures for doing that yet, but I'd like to see if my approach from the beginning worked or not.
So just picking up on that, on some of the points that Roger made earlier, I think one, tracking our decisions. So, you know, Roger mentioned how his team tracks the decisions and how they've arrived at the final output. It's what we tried to do at National Archives as well, because we knew that we needed some level of rigor, that the appraisal and the sort of more opaque appraisal and selection processes that we were used to as archivists weren't going to fly in the digital environment, especially with the levels of institutional distrust that we were seeing at the national level. So we knew that we needed some way to be able to track what it is that we were doing. I think that there's also sort of where we get into precision and recall, and this is where it becomes important to understand precision and recall within the records. So understanding the records so you can have faith in the output of the records. And I think that really is kind of counteracts along with the tracking of what we are doing as a mechanism to kind of balance our own bias. But I think if we don't pay attention to the precision and recall in the machine, we can potentially skew history. So I think we need to be mindful of that. Then I think there's a third level of bias, and this is bias that we need to accept. And this is bias that exists in the historical record by virtue of the fact that it represents a time and a space. Which is why I push back slightly on some of the social justice movement I'm hearing and seeing in the United States and Canada. It's not that I don't think that we should be mindful that there have been discriminatory or oppressive practices, but we need to respect that bias in order to enable restorative justice processes. Because these records reflect what these institutions were thinking at the time and the subsequent policies that fall out. And if we're compensating for that, then from a legal perspective, how do you prove that the bias existed by using a machine when we potentially have put in material that then recalibrates everything and makes it look like potentially nothing was actually happening? So I think we just need to be mindful of accepting a certain level of bias when we do appraisal and selection in these records, and how we can, in different ways, enable social justice within the archival community without compromising the integrity of the record.
And Roger, I do want to follow up on one thing you said earlier as a question from the audience. Barbara says that earlier you expressed your concern for bias because you were the only person kind of working on training your set of records, your machine. How do you mitigate that, or did you ever find a way that you can mitigate those concerns? Is it including more people in the process, or more iteration, or is there a way that we can mitigate that?
I'm not certain, other than what was just said about precision and recall, and I'm not a statistician. I'm terrible in math. I just go by what Gordon says, that if we've reached that point where that he's comfortable with that, and I don't have the numbers in front of me for Governor McDonald, but I believe the recall and precision were over 80%. But I think the only thing we can do is maybe have someone else go back and look behind me. Again, a sample. Don't have to go into any depth, or that defeats the whole purpose of using the tool, but to see if anything pops up. I really don't know other than that. I just know that I have a lot of power in shaping the historic record, and with that comes responsibilities to mitigate any biases, but I'm not quite sure what the best way is to do that. This is all new to us, but we're going to have to figure it out, or at least come up with something we're comfortable with, because as I indicated, you're going to need to use these tools to deal with electronic records just in the vast quantities, whether it be email or other material. I've been focusing on email, but you can use these for, you know, electronic records in general, like Word documents, etc., if you want.
And I wanted to just say that we're getting very close to the end. So if any of our audience members have some questions, you know, now is your chance. But I'm going to ask Roger and Anthea to do a truly horrible thing, which is to boil down all of their comments into a single final nugget of wisdom, which is to say, you know, for those of us who aren't experienced, who've never used these tools before, never encountered artificial intelligence or machine learning in the wild, you know, what's the biggest takeaway for a novice from this call? You know, if I'm going back to my archives and I'm going to appraise some email, or if I'm going to work with a government agency who's clearly using these tools and techniques in their records creation process, what's the best piece of advice you can give to someone who's just starting out?
Start small. Don't be afraid to experiment. I learned more when we were doing the testing from the small little archival set of records that we were going through than I did from the massive set of records. The things you learn on the small projects are transferable to all projects.
I would say, I would echo those sentiments and just be willing to try something and failing. When we started doing the manual or the review of the email, the Kane email, even before using the tool, we had no idea if that was going to work. We had no idea what we were doing. And I failed numerous times and had to go back and re-review stuff over and over again. That's part of it. And you have to be willing to accept that, because this will never be perfect, but it can help narrow and make the pile smaller and more manageable. Ultimately, for access purposes, that's the end game.
Thank you both. I don't know if I want to hand it back to you now, Anne.
Thank you, Nick. And thank you so much, Anthea and Roger. This has been a fascinating conversation. I've learned an awful lot, and really being kind of an outsider to the archival world, I think this has just been really terrific. I just wanted to let everyone know that, as you probably know already, this conversation is being recorded, and we hope to have it posted on COSA's YouTube channel in probably within a couple of weeks, as soon as we can, and we'll get the word out about that with the links, so that you can revisit and also share it with colleagues. This has been a lot of fun. Looking at Nick, it's been a lot of fun, Nick. No, it really has, and to have two great presenters here with us to kind of walk us through and talk about it has been just terrific. So thank you very much. And we hope to do something like this again in the future. So we'll keep everybody posted about that as well. So with that, I'm going to say goodbye, and we'll see you back here at some future point. So thanks for joining us. Barbara Teague, did you want to say anything? She's our executive director here at COSA. She's sitting there and talking. You're on mute, dear.
And I've done all the wrong Zoom things today. I just wanted to say thank you to Anthea and Roger, because I think that it really was very enlightening, even for those of us who've been reading and trying to understand what's happening. But I think having you talk about specific projects and then distill that was very helpful to us. So thank you.
Thank you very much for having us. And thank you to Nick for great moderation.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for providing all the content, really. The both of you.
Good job. Take care, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Bye.
You too.